Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Judges in our continuing study of ancient history as a framework for the Bible. We go now to 1200 BC as the Indo-European tribes from the north begin a movement. I don't know whether to call it an invasion or a migration, but the result is the same in either case. There are those who move down into the Greek peninsula. They destroy the Mycenaean civilization. They also move from there down into Crete, although Crete has already, where we had formerly the Minoan civilization, that had already come under sort of the thumb and the authority of Mycenae. But the Mycenaean civilization, the city-states are broken up. They will not be again reunited. The same Indo-European tribes seem to be the ones who attacked Troy. Troy falls at this time. The city of Troy, now it had already been there a long period of time, and it had its ups and downs. This fall is going to give rise, hundreds of years later, it will be remembered in Homer's epic, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that speak of the fall of Troy on the fields of Ilium. Next we have those same tribes, or maybe other tribes, because when somebody moves into town, you might decide to move out. But there are groups that move into the Anatolian plateau, and they come to the Hittite civilization, and the Hittite civilization collapses in a big way. What was a civilization before now breaks up into a few surviving scattered small city-states. There are still Hittites, but they are no longer going to be unified in one big civilization. There's also at this time the Sea Peoples who move down along the coast and try to invade Egypt. They are stopped only by Ramses III of Egypt, who fights them to a standstill and does allow some of them to settle in southern Palestine, where they give rise to what we know as the Philistines. Now, in the book of Judges, we have set forth, in Judges chapter 2 in particular, a cycle of sin that takes place. We begin where the Israelites had been delivered by God. He had raised up a deliverer to save them from their enemies. But then after things get good, the people begin to forget the Lord. The Israelites do evil in the sight of the Lord. Sin enters the camp. And as a result, God judges them. He sends judgment. He sells them into the hand of their enemies, and that causes them to repent and turn back to the Lord. We read, and when the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord, that the Lord raised up a deliverance. And so it goes round and round, and the cycle continues all throughout the book of the Judges. We begin that book with a prologue in two parts, and in one of those parts it actually sets forth the cycle that I just described. And then we have only a few verses given over to the Othniel narrative. We read in Judges chapter 3 verse 8, then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, so he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rithaim, the king of Mesopotamia. Now Mesopotamia is a big place. The sons of Israel served Cushan-Rithaim 8 years, and when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the sons of Israel to deliver them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. Now, we're not told where in Mesopotamia this group comes from, but we do know that it's around this time that we have the kingdom of Mitanni. We don't know much about that kingdom. In fact, we're told more about that kingdom by its surrounding vassal states, like Uzi and others. But perhaps the kingdom of Mitanni, or perhaps others, come down and conduct what looks like just a raid down into Canaan. And the Lord delivers them from those raiders. Next, we have the Ehud narrative. Now, Ehud is a social outcast, although he's a judge. You say, well, what makes him a social outcast? What makes him a social outcast is that he is a left-handed man. You say, well, what's wrong with that? You just need a different catcher's mitt. No. In that culture, you did not have spoons and forks, and so you ate with your fingers. And remember, you also didn't have toilet paper, so you eat with one hand, your right hand, and you take care of other business with your left hand. And to have somebody who's a left-handed person coming in is just considered bad form. Even today, if you go to the Middle East, you're warned by your guides, do not try to touch anybody or shake hands or anything with your left hand. That's the hand for other things. Right hand is the hand, your social hand, the hand with which you eat. Now, Ehud is going to deliver the Israelites from Moab, and God will in particular use his left-handedness in this deliverance. The Moabites, living south of the Arnon River on the east side of the Dead Sea, they are going to invade Canaan. Moab and Ammon are sort of twin communities. They're more often than not they're on each other's side, because these were both descendants of Lot, going back to Genesis, the book of Genesis. And this threefold group, the Amalekites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, they are all sort of coming up against the Israelites. And they come to the city of Jericho. You say, wait a minute, the city of Jericho had been destroyed by Joshua. It had. But it is still called the city of palm trees, because there's still, even though the city had been destroyed, there's still palm trees there. There's a water source. And I don't know if the city itself had been rebuilt to the old, to the old structure. But it's still a place where you can come and reside. And the king of Moab comes here. And he is collecting taxes and bribes and things like that from the Israelites, blackmailing them. If you want to not get raided, killed, pillaged, then be sure you bring me monetary equivalents. They didn't actually have coins, so you would bring, different farm implements and things that were gifts to buy off that king. And here in Judges chapter 3, verse 15, we read when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. And it's a little bit of a play on words, because he is a left-handed man, literally a man bound in his right hand, but he's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's a Benjamite, and the word Benjamin literally means son. That's the word Ben-Yamaim, son of the right hand. So here's a son of the right hand who's bound in his right hand, and the sons of Israel send tribute by him to Eglon, king of Moab, and of course this is taking place in Jericho. And Ehud made himself a sword. Now, it probably wasn't much of a sword to look at. Didn't necessarily have a scabbard or a guard or things like that. Might not have even been made of metal, but he makes himself sort of a sword stand-in, which has two edges. It is a cubit in length, about 18 inches, about the length from your fingertip to your elbow, or maybe in Ehud's case, the length from his fingertip to his elbow. And he bound it on his right thigh under his cloak. That is, he's putting it in a place where his right hand might not be able to reach it, but his left hand will be able to. So that it's actually his left-handedness that is going to be involved here. And he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. And we're told, I'm not sure if we needed to know this, but we're told Eglon was a very fat man. He had grown fat, it seems like he'd grown fat in robbing and pillaging the Israelites. And Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. You want to translate that, maybe the ancient equivalent of the restroom. Place where he could sort of get away and take care of business. And Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat, and Ehud stretched out his left hand and took the sword from his right thigh, that is, in a place where his left hand could reach it, and thrust it into his belly. The handle also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the refuse came out. Yeah, this gets rather graphic. And that's the point of the story, is that God uses even things like his fatness to cover up the deed where it's not immediately obvious. And Ehud went out into the vestibule and shut the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. And when he had gone out, his servants came, that is the servants of Eglon, the king, the evil king, came and looked, and behold, the doors of the roof chamber were locked. And they said, well, he's just taking care of business. He's only relieving himself in the cool room. And they waited, and they wait, and after a while they're thinking, okay, something's wrong here, until they became anxious. But behold, he did not open the doors of the roof chamber. Therefore they took the key and opened them, and behold, their master had fallen to the floor, dead, with nothing apparent. Remember, the fat had closed over this makeshift sword, so it wasn't even apparent how he had died. Now, we're told how he had died, but they did not necessarily know. Meanwhile, Ehud uses that opportunity to raise the Israelites up, drive out the oppressor, and deliver the Israelites. Our next story is in Judges chapters 4 and 5. The story is in 4. In chapter 5 there's a song about it, and that is the Deborah-Barak narrative, where Deborah, the prophetess, it's interesting that they would have had a prophet who was a woman. She's a prophetess, but she's also a judge. And God speaks to her and says, I'm going to raise you up to deliver Israel. I want you to go to one of the tribal leaders, Barak, and I want you to tell Barak that he's to lead the Israelites into battle against the Canaanites. You say, weren't the Canaanites beaten in the days of Joshua? Well, some of them were, but others remained, and others continue to grow and develop. I mean, this is not, like the next day or the next week. A number of years have passed by the time this takes place. And so Deborah goes to Barak, and Barak says, well, I'll go into battle if you will go with me. And Deborah says, because of that, it will be said that a woman has been the deliverer of Israel. And that woman's not going to be Deborah. It's actually going to be another woman. What happens is they go into battle. They go into battle against the king of Hatzor and his chief general, Sisera. And Sisera has gathered the armies of Canaan, specifically the armies of Hatzor. Hatzor is that same place that Joshua had defeated back in Joshua chapter 11. It's located to the northwest of the Sea of Galilee. It has been excavated, and this was the largest city in all of Canaan. The excavations here have been rather extensive, and we have found a very large city, especially for Canaanite standards. It was a city of idol worshippers. It was a typical Canaanite city. And the general of the armies of Hatzor comes down to the valley of Jezreel, because you don't want to fight battles up in the hills. It's just too hard to mobilize people. And so he comes down to this nice flat level ground, and they are assembled at Mount Tabor. Now, first of all, let's look at the valley of Jezreel. Some folks today popularly call this the valley of Armageddon, probably a misnomer, but there is a city, Megiddo, that was there. That's why you say Armageddon. It just means mountain of Megiddo. But it's the one wide open valley in all of Canaan. And I want to take you now to Mount Tabor. Tabor's easy to see because it's at the eastern end of the valley, and this is the place where Sisera brings his armies. They sort of rally around this common vantage point, and Deborah and Barak and the armies of Israel go out to meet them. And in the battle, we're told, that not only did they win, in the song that Deborah sings in Judges chapter 5, she speaks in the song. Now, this might just be a poetical happenstance, but she speaks about the Kishon overflowing its banks. Now, the Kishon is this little tiny stream. Can't even really call it a river. It's a little tiny stream that flows, into the Mediterranean through the valley. You almost don't notice it when you're going past it because it's such a small thing. For it to overflow its banks, we have to wonder: is this just poetic speech, or maybe did it rain that day? And indeed, it wouldn't take much rain for this small little stream to overflow its banks and maybe turn the valley into sort of a quagmire, in which both the soldiers and especially chariots would be virtually useless. In any case, Sisera loses the battle to the Israelites, and he flees. And when he flees, the place of this name, the name of the place is given a place name. It's called Harosheth ha-goyim. Now, ha is the word for thee, and goyim is nations. So it is the cutting of the nations. And it's striking here, excuse the pun, it's striking that the nations are cut down, the Canaanite nations, because later on when we get to the book of Revelation, this same valley will be the scene of a place for the gathering of the nations at a place that they call Mount Megiddo or Har Mageddon. We call it Armageddon. Again, a place that at least symbolically, if not literally, will be the cutting of the nations. Well, as we said, Deborah and Barak defeat Sisera, and Sisera runs to a place where he finds refuge, the tent of a woman named Jael. And Jael says, "Oh, you're that Canaanite general. Here, you can sleep here," and sort of covers him up and takes care of him. And then when he's asleep, she takes a tent peg and drives it through his skull. So here is the woman who slays the enemy with a blow to the head. All right, next we have the Gideon narrative. Gideon is introduced when he first comes on the scene. Again, the Israelites have wandered from God. Again, God has sent this time the Midianites against them, and the Lord sends the angel of the Lord comes to Gideon, and when we see him, he is threshing wheat. And you say, well, that's nice. He's a farmer. He's threshing wheat. But he's not threshing wheat on a threshing floor. A threshing floor would be a big, wide, open space, preferably high up, where you would take the grain, you would ground it, and you would throw it up in the air, and then the wind would catch the chaff and blow it away. Meanwhile, the heavier kernels of grain would fall there to the ground, and you would gather them up, and that's the part you're going to use to make bread and other things. Well, Gideon is threshing wheat, but he's not doing it on a threshing floor. Instead, he's threshing wheat in a wine press. Now, a wine press is the worst possible place to thresh grain, because that's a wine press is an enclosed place. You put a bunch of grapes in it, you stomp on them, you turn them to sort of mush, the liquid comes out, and you gather that up, and you make your wine. You don't want to try to thresh grain in a wine press. It won't work very good. Why is he doing this? He's doing this because he's afraid that the Midianites might come, see his grain, and steal it. So he's hiding. And the angel comes to him and says, "Hail, O valiant warrior." He doesn't look anything like a valiant warrior. He looks like a scaredy cat. He's afraid and he's hiding. But God is going to use him, and God instructs him to gather the armies of Israel, and he does so. And initially there's like 30,000+ of these armies, and God says, "You have way too many people. I want you to tell anyone who's afraid to go home." I imagine Gideon probably says, "Well, does that mean I can go?" Well, he doesn't actually ask that, but he puts out the word, anyone who's afraid can go home, and a good chunk of them leave. Now he's down to about 22,000. And God says, "You still have too many people. Take them all down, get a drink of water at the brook, and whoever puts his face down in the water and drinks right from the water, like you would like a water fountain, tell him to go home, and only keep those that use their hand to drop the water to their face." Not that there's anything bad about one way or good about the other way, but it's just a way to divide, one group from the other. And he sends all those home, and he's left with only 300. And God says, "That's perfect. That's what we're going to use." And so the armies of Israel, such as they are, all 300 of them, are going to go up against the Midianite camp that numbers in the thousands upon thousands upon thousands. They're described like locusts on the land. We don't know how many there are. And what do you do when you're outnumbered like that? Well, Gideon surrounds them, and he instructs them, "I want you to take a trumpet." You would take a ram's horn and sort of hollow it out, and you'd be able to blow through that and get a certain sound of a trumpet in one hand, and I want you to take a pitcher that is a pot with a torch in it, a lit torch in the other hand, but the pot's going to hide the fire. And I want you to surround the camp, and then at the appointed time, I want you to break the pot, wave the torch in the hand with one hand, blow the trumpet with the other hand. Notice I've got two hands, and they're full of torches and horns and pots. I've not got any hand for weapons. Gideon doesn't say anything about weapons. Instead, he's going to blow the trumpet, wave the torch, and yell out, "The sword of the Lord for Gideon," because they don't have their own sword. And the Midianites come out of their tents, and they begin, because this is a night attack, and they begin fighting among themselves. They think they're being attacked. And they actually fight themselves into a complete defeat. And so, again, there is deliverance that takes place. Now, Gideon has a son. At the end of that story, the people want to make Gideon their king. And Gideon says, no, God is your king. I'm not going to do that. But when we read about his son's name is Abimelech. Abi is my father, and Melech is the word for king. So his name means my father the king, which is interesting because Gideon had said, I'm not going to be your king, but his son's name is my father the king, Abimelech. Did Gideon name him that? Or did Abimelech later on change his name to that? We're not sure, but Abimelech tries to be the king. And he does so by attacking first one place and then another place. He does get a little bit of a following, and he comes to Shechem, and they've initially agreed to follow him, but then they have a falling out, and the people of Shechem, they're not going to follow Abimelech anymore, and so he goes to attack them. He goes to destroy them. They all run into a tower, and he goes to tear the tower down, to destroy them. And they're in the tower, and he's besieging the tower and actually trying to break in with his soldiers. And a woman takes a millstone and throws it over the edge of the tower, and it happens to hit Abimelech on the head. And it is a mortal wound. At least he thinks it's a mortal wound, probably is. And as he's dying, he says to his armor bearer, he says, "Quick, take out your sword and kill me so that it won't be said that a woman killed Abimelech." Well, guess what? 3,000 years later, we're still saying a woman killed Abimelech. And so we have a victory from the woman. Notice we have two stories here in the book of Judges. One is how the enemy Sisera was killed by a woman, 10 peg through the head. We mentioned that. And now Abimelech, he's killed by a woman. Again, a blow to the head, a millstone crushes his head. It reminds us of that prophecy way back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that talk about the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and how the enemies of God would be destroyed by a blow to the head. And here that is being echoed right here in the book of Judges, not once but twice. Well, we have then, in the story of Deborah and Barak, we had a woman slays the enemy of God's people with a blow to the head. Again, here in the Abimelech narrative, a woman slays the enemy. Abimelech is the enemy, and she slays him with a blow to the head. Next, we hear the story of Jephthah. Again, he is a social outcast. He is a deliverer. God uses him to deliver the Israelites as they're being oppressed with enemies to the east of the Jordan. In this case, it's not Moab. In this case, it's the Ammonites who have brought about this oppression. Not only the Ammonites, but the Philistines as well are teamed up against the Israelites. And after he has won the victory, Jephthah makes a vow to the Lord. He says, as he's coming home, he says, whatever comes out of my house, the first thing that comes out of my house, I will give to the Lord. And as it turns out, as he gets there, it is his daughter who comes out to greet him. I don't know if he was expecting the family dog and he didn't care much for the dog. I don't know what he was thinking, but it is his daughter. And he says, I'm going to give her to the Lord. Now, the meaning of that vow, scholars have taken in a variety of ways. Does he mean she's going to be dedicated to God? That she won't be married, she'll just be serving the Lord all her life? Or, as most readers have seen this throughout the past, and I think they might be right, was this a human sacrifice? Now, the book of Judges is not saying anywhere that Jephthah's vow was good. He should have made it. That's good and proper. It's not advocating human sacrifices. It's simply telling the story of what happened. To the idea that it is merely a dedication to God, it is argued that being a judge, Jephthah must have been God-fearing and would not have violated the law. However, the promise of a simple animal sacrifice would not be a convincing vow in this situation. And in the extremity of it, it is understandable, not that we advocate it, but you can see where he thought to give the highest possible vow. It is argued that the Spirit of the Lord He comes on Jephthah. And when we get to Hebrews chapter 11, we read of Jephthah as one of the heroes of the faith. But this human sacrifice does not take place while the Spirit of the Lord is said to be on him. And it never speaks positively of the sacrifice, of giving his daughter to God. It merely speaks of his faith. On the one hand, the daughter bewails her virginity. And in Judges chapter 11, verse 29, it summarizes that she knew not a man. But that is a big deal among the people of that age. And it is argued that burnt offerings involve death in all 286 Old Testament instances where we read of burnt offerings, of ascending offerings. On the one hand, Exodus chapters 38 and 8, and again in 1 Samuel 2 verse 22, speak of woman as there are certain women who gave service in the tabernacle. But if this was merely serving in the tabernacle, why would anybody be mourning over it? Why would they be saying, oh, that's a wonderful thing. She's going to serve the Lord in the tabernacle. That'd be a good thing. And it is not described as a good thing. It's true that human sacrifice was a clear violation of God's law, that public opinion would have disallowed it, except that in Canaan, it was considered something that was acceptable among the Canaanites. Indeed, human sacrifice was viewed as a last-ditch effort in battle. We read about that in 2 Kings chapter 3, where the king of Moab takes his own child and sacrifices him at the beginning of a battle because of what he sees as dire straits. Now, Leviticus chapter 27, verses 8 and 9 allows for the redemption of humans who had been vowed for sacrifice. Certain people were to be given over to God, and yet they could be redeemed, they could be purchased back from that. On the other hand, we really don't read of Jephthah really having any knowledge either way of the law. He's just acting more on the cultural norm, maybe on by this time, the Israelite folk religion, instead of acting in accordance with the law. Well, in any case, when we compare the Jephthah narrative, remember that this aligns and is contrasted to and parallels the Ehud narrative, where again we see a judge who is a social outcast. Now, he's not a social outcast for the same reason. In Jephthah's case, it is because he was illegitimate, and he had sons by a marriage, or he had half-brothers by a marriage, and they had driven him out. So he's a social outcast for that reason. Again, there's oppressors from the east of the Jordan. It's not Moab this time it's Ammon. But we can see the parallel. And finally, we come to the Samson narrative. Samson has been called the he-man with the she weakness. He has this thing of going after girls that look pretty. And his rivals will be the Philistines. Now, we mentioned at the outset that the sea peoples, we're not sure exactly who the sea peoples were. They seem to be from Indo-Europeans from the north. But here's a group who had overrun the entire eastern Mediterranean and even come down and try to conquer Egypt. And they are stopped by Ramses III. But he allows some of them, a group known as the Peleset, or we call them Philistines, he allowed them to settle in southwestern Canaan. Now, there had already been a group here, a colony here. Was it a Minoan colony? I can't say for sure that it was, but it looks like them, and the pottery looks a bit and reminds us a bit both of Minoans and other colonies from the Mycenaeans and Minoans. The Philistines that are here, we have paintings of them, not so much in Philistia as much as in Egypt, where Ramses III, to commemorate his victory, he had pictures drawn up, wall paintings drawn up, of what they looked like, these Philistines against whom he had fought. Now the cities of the Philistines included, here we have them in blue, Timnah and Ekron, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. And over against those were some of the cities that would eventually be Israelite cities. Now I put Jerusalem up here, although Jerusalem was not yet an Israelite city, it's still Canaanite. But the Samson story takes place in and around a place called Beth Shemesh. Beth is the word for house. Shemesh is the Hebrew word for the sun, so house of the sun. And it's not up in the mountains; it's in the foothills. What the Israelis call the Jephthah, the foothills that are sort of the boundary between the land of the Philistines down in the plain and the mountains of the Israelites. They're up in the mountains. And in the Samson story, we start out at his birth, where he is put under what looks like a Nazirite vow, where he is not to cut his hair, and he is not to drink strong drink, not to come into contact with the dead. And that's not just for a period of time. That is in his case, it's a perpetual vow. And as he grows up, we see that he gets a girlfriend. He sees a girl he likes, but she's not an Israelite girl. He desires a Philistine woman. The Philistines were the most highly cultured people of the area. They were not, sometimes we describe, he's just a Philistine. We think of a big burly brute. No, the Philistines, they had the secret of smelting iron. They were technologically advanced, much more advanced than the Israelites, who did not know how to smelt iron. In fact, if an Israelite needed to have his farm implement sharpened, he would have to go down to the Philistine blacksmith. The Philistine blacksmith would take it in the back room, do what he had to do with it, not show the Israelites how to do it, and then he would give him the farm implement back for a price. And it was a carefully guarded secret, and would continue to be until the time when David becomes king. Well, Samson takes a Philistine as a bride, and that doesn't work too well. There's a incident at the wedding feast where he makes a foolish wager, and it's a riddle wager, and they get the answer to the riddle from his bride, and as a result, conflict breaks out, and a number of Philistines are killed. And Samson seeks vengeance, and actually that vengeance goes both ways. His bride is eventually taken and killed, as well as her family. And it escalates as more and more Philistines are being killed. The Israelites aren't being killed, but the Philistines are. And finally, Samson is captured. Actually, the Israelites give him over to the Philistines, and at Lehi, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and he breaks his bonds asunder, and he grabs the nearest weapon, which happens to be the jawbone of a donkey, a jawbone of an ass, and he begins striking right and left, and again, a great number of Philistines are killed. Later on, he goes down to Gaza, one of the cities of the Philistines. He's seen another woman this time, another Philistine woman. This time she's a prostitute. And the Philistines lock the gate, try to lock him in, try to capture him. And he breaks through the gates and actually carries the gates all the way up to Hebron, far inland. It's sort of not just a feat of strength, but a feat of great shame upon the Philistines. And finally, at the end of Samson's life, we read about another girl, still another one, Delilah. Now, she's not the prostitute. She's another Philistine woman. And he's romancing her. And she is approached by the Philistines, who say, can you please find the secret of his strength? They offer her money. They threaten her. And she agrees to do it. And she asks the secret of his strength. He at first does not tell her, but ultimately he does, that he has been told by God, do these things, and, don't touch strong drink, don't touch the dead, let your hair grow, and as he has been faithful, so of course he hasn't been very faithful in other things, but he's been faithful in that area, his strength has increased, and she cuts his hair, and he loses his strength, and he is captured by the Philistines. He is blinded by them. And the story ends a few years later when he is brought into one of their temples and made to stand between two pillars. It's interesting that when we look at some of the temples of the Philistines, they are structured around two central pillars, just the way the Bible describes. And Samson, even though his hair has been cut and it's begun to grow, but it's not his hair, the Lord gives him strength now, and he pushes these pillars down, and he brings the house down, killing himself and a great number of the Philistines as well. Now that's the Samson narrative. Finally, we have an epilogue, and it is given to us in two parts, two last stories, and we need to talk a bit about these stories because they come up later in the historical books in the narrative. We read to introduce those stories, Judges chapter 17, verse 6. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And that becomes the refrain. That's going to be repeated on several occasions. That there was no king in Israel. Now, if you're saying that, that means that by the time you're saying this, by the time you're telling the story, there is a king in the land. So this is told, the story of the book of Judges is told after they finally do have kings like Saul and David and Solomon. But in those days, there was no king in Israel. And everyone was just doing their own thing, and that was not a good thing. Now, we're told then a story that introduces a story about a Levite who is from Bethlehem. And he leaves Bethlehem, and he goes and he becomes a priest, first of all, to a man in Ephraim who hires him as sort of a personal priest, and it's not a pleasant story. But then the people of Dan, the people of the same tribe from which from which Samson had come, the people of Dan relocate, and as they are relocating, they come through Ephraim. They meet this Levi. They hire him away from the man of Ephraim who had hired him, and they go. And they not only take that man, but they take some of his gods, false idols, and they all go up to Dan, to a new place, as far north as you can be, and barely be in the land of Israel, way up in the north of the Sea of Galilee, at the very edge of Mount Hermon, and they conquer a city, and they found a city, and they call it Dan. And that's going to be there. It will be the northernmost city in all of Israel. A place of idol worship. It will be a place of great sin. But this is how the city of Dan is founded, and it will be there. In fact, it's from there that the Jordan River comes down. The Jordan River might well get its name from this, because the word Jordan means descent, the Jor of Dan, the descent from Dan. And so from Mount Hermon, as the Jordan begins, it descends all the way down to the Dead Sea. So they leave Dan, their inheritance that God had given them, and they relocate to this place far in the north that becomes the new place now known as Dan. That's the first story. The second story starts in chapter 19, verse 1. And again, it starts in Bethlehem. There's a concubine from Bethlehem. And in the story, she's going to be murdered in Gibeah, and that's going to spark a war against the tribe of Benjamin. Here's this concubine. She's from Bethlehem. She had married a man from the hill country of Ephraim, but she goes running home to daddy. And he comes down to Bethlehem to get her, and he spends a few days with his father-in-law, and he says, I better get going. Father-in-law says, well, why don't you stay an extra day or so? And he does stay for a time. But finally he says, no, I really need to get going. And he's heading back home, back to the hill country of Ephraim. And the story actually tells us he's passing by Jebus, which is another word named for Jerusalem. And he doesn't want to stay at that bad old Jerusalem because there's Canaanites there, and who knows what could happen there. So he continues past, even though it's getting late, and he comes to Gibeah. Now, this is not the same as Gibeon, the Canaanite city that made peace with Israel in the days of Joshua. This is a different city. This is Gibeah. It's a city in the tribe of Benjamin. And he comes to little Gibeah, and he's going to sort of camp outside. And there's an old man there, and says, oh, you want to be careful here. This is not a safe place to be. What do you mean? This is a city of Benjamin. No, why don't you come indoors? And they go indoors, they lock the door. And meanwhile, the men of the city come around the house where he is. And they say to the old man, throw out your visitor. We want to know him in the biblical sense. We want to abuse him. And trying to preserve laws of hospitality, the old man says, oh, please don't do that. They insist. And eventually they take the man's concubine, the one from Bethlehem, and they throw her out instead, and she is raped all night and left, and she dies. They kill her, they rape her and kill her in Gibeah. Instead of showing hospitality, they show the exact opposite of hospitality. They act like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. When the next morning comes, and the dust is settled. The man from Ephraim takes his wife's body, takes it back home to Ephraim, but then he takes it, instead of burying it, he cuts the lifeless body into 12 pieces and has them sent to all of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now that's a gruesome story, and it's meant to be. And the people look, an arm and a leg, and yuck, what is this? What on earth has happened here? And the message that goes out is, this is what happened at Gibeah. Instead of hospitality, which should have been shown, there was great evil, and the Israelites gathered to punish Gibeah, and the tribe of Benjamin says, wait a minute, you can't mess with them. That's our city. Those are our people, my people. And the upshot is that the other tribes of Israel go to war against the tribe of Benjamin, and the tribe of Benjamin is almost completely wiped out. The second story then tells us of a concubine from Bethlehem who's murdered in Gibeah and sparks a war against the tribe of Benjamin. The book of Judges ends on that note, and it ends again with that refrain, how in those days there was no king in Israel, every man did what was right in his own eyes. But there's another story, and that's not found in the book of Judges. It's found when we turn the page now to the book of Ruth, where again, all three of these stories, notice they start in Bethlehem. Naomi is from Bethlehem. Her and her family leave Bethlehem. They go down to Moab, where Naomi's family, both her husband and her two sons, die. And meanwhile, the two sons have taken wives for themselves, and one of those wives goes home to daddy. But the other wife, Ruth, stays with Naomi, and Ruth and Naomi, they return to Bethlehem, where we're going to see that Ruth ultimately has the grandfather of David. So the Ruth story, it starts off with Naomi's bitterness, where it's all bad news. She starts off in Bethlehem, and her family, because of a famine, they go to Moab. They leave the promised land, they go to this other land. Her sons get foreign wives, and they're in the land, and then bad things happen in that land, and Naomi's husband dies, her sons die, she's left with two daughters-in-law, and one of them goes home to daddy. The other one, Ruth, resolves she's going to go with Naomi. She says, I'm going to go with you. Your land will be my land. Your God will be my God. May Lord so do to me, if anything but death divides me, separates me from you. And so they go back to Bethlehem. They are destitute, and it's back in Bethlehem that Ruth meets a potential kinsman redeemer. We have to speak about what that is, because the inheritance is in danger of being lost, so that Naomi, and in this case Ruth, who is associated with Naomi, they must have a male heir for the inheritance to be kept within that family line. And she meets Boaz, who is a cousin, a relative of the deceased, and she finds out this is one who potentially could come and be sort of the stand-in husband to bear a son by which that line might be preserved. And so Ruth goes to Boaz by night on a threshing floor. We talked about threshing floors with Gideon. Big wide open space where they've been threshing grain, and there in the middle of the night, Ruth goes to Boaz. He feels that he's sleeping out under the stars. He feels a draft down below, and he says, what is that? And she says, it's me. I am, and she's basically making a marriage proposal, a proposal that he fulfilled that Levirate law of that he would be her kinsman redeemer, and he agrees. However, he says, there's only a problem. The problem is that there's a closer relative. I have to clear it with him first. And so he says, you just keep quiet and don't tell anyone. Don't let it be known that you were here. It wouldn't look appropriate. And so the next day, he goes and meets with this relative. And he says, there's this great piece of land you can have. It's part of the family. And the relative says, oh, that's great. I'd like to have that piece of land. Boaz says, only one problem with it. Ruth, the Moabitess, comes with the land. He says, oh, no, that doesn't work for me. And so Boaz acquires the right to be the kinsman redeemer. They go through this funny little ritual where you would, if you're sealing the deal on this concerning land, you would take off your sandal and give it to the other person. And they go through this little ritual, and Boaz acquires the right to be the kinsman redeemer, and now he takes Ruth to be his wife, and the child that she will have, yes, will be his son, but will also be the legal heir that had been lost of the husband of Naomi. And so at the end of the story, the child is taken and put into Naomi's lap, as if to show, yes, this is, physically this is Ruth's child, but in a legal sense, this is Naomi's grandchild. And whereas before Naomi had come back and said, don't call me Naomi anymore, that means pleasant, call me Mara, call me bitter. But now she is greatly blessed, and the people of the village, the women of the village, gather around her and say, isn't this wonderful? Isn't Ruth wonderful to you? She's better to you than a whole bunch of sons. And so the story ends, but again, it's one of those stories that takes place when the judges judge. In fact, that's the very chapter 1, verse 1 of Ruth, talks about how when the judges judge. And at the end of the story, you find out that this child grows up to be the grandfather of King David. And the point of the story, in fact, the point of all three of these stories, remember they're all focused around Bethlehem, is that in those days there was no king in Israel. But they needed the king, and not just any old king, they needed the king from Bethlehem. And of course that's speaking in the immediate of King David, but I want to suggest that ultimately it's speaking about the greater king from Bethlehem, the son of David. It's speaking of Jesus the Messiah. They needed that king from Bethlehem.